heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
Hello and welcome back to Louis Sinclair Investigates the Dodleston Mysteries. With new discoveries, new revelations, backed up with irrefutable evidence that could completely rewrite the whole story. Because sometimes even the most carefully concealed secret can be exposed by the smallest of clues. Clues that today I'm going to reveal almost certainly for the very first time. But of course, there's always a downside when you threaten to reveal a secret. Like what happens when someone or something doesn't want that secret to be revealed? And what might they do to stop it from being revealed? And that's the subject of this first bonus video, Sabotage. Seemingly attempts to block revelations, and not just revelations by me, but, as I've recently found out, also by other researchers into these strange events. Attempts, in my case, that gradually became very dark, even life-threatening, and seemingly designed to scare off anyone who looks too closely at the Dodleston mysteries, the Dodleston messages. Indeed, only a few years ago, even Gary M. Rowe, the respected ufologist in the story, said that getting too involved would come at a price, as I and others appear to have found out. And then in the second video, Sabotage, but by whom and why? I'll show you those clues in messages and dreams that seemingly were never meant to have been spotted. Accidental slip-ups by someone or something that point to a completely new interpretation of Ken Webster's remarkable book, The Vertical Plane. And then I'll explain why that someone or something would do anything to stop any of us figuring out what was really going on in the tiny English village of Dodleston exactly 40 years ago. Honestly, it's a rabbit hole like no other that I've ever entered in my many investigations of our mysterious world. There's something very dark about this one, as echoed by a young resident of Dodleston in a comment on the excellent Paranormality UK channel on YouTube. Referring to Meadow Cottage, the location of all the events, he wrote, "I grew up in Dodleston in the mid-80s, and I always used to run past the house to the shop, as there's something about it I never liked." In the main series, I took The Vertical Plane at face value. You'll recall that in 1984, an ominous year, Ken Webster, Debbie Oakes and Peter Trinder had started getting messages on a pre-internet BBC microcomputer, allegedly from a chap called Lucas, a fugitive priest living in medieval England. Communications through time. And as if that weren't bizarre enough, Lucas claimed to have a fully working BBC micro himself, on which he was composing these messages, because he said that his computer seems to me to be identical to your computer. Rather strange, to say the least, but just as strange was that those medieval messages from Lucas were, as I showed in the original series, nothing more than linguistic rubbish. Grammatically illiterate, with vocabulary that was 100 years out of date, and supposedly written by someone, Lucas, who'd been the dean, the main academic of an Oxford University college. It's simply not credible. And then, as if in answer to that, we were introduced to a mysterious entity identifying itself as 2109 and found out that it had been altering Lucas's messages. Indeed, Lucas himself had complained that his messages were being moved, or as we translate it, changed or influenced. "Please tell me why you do move my writing so, 2109, including grumbling about the badly spelt words that, for some mysterious reason, had been added by 2109. Pointers that, as we saw in the main series, had been deliberately left there for us to find. Why? Because, as we found out, 2109 was some kind of collective of entities that claimed to be running an experiment with time, and who had recruited Lucas to be, in effect, an experimental guinea pig along with the 1980s folk. With its experiment, the collective had two aims. First, to see if it were possible to overlap the two different times, medieval and present. But more than that, the purpose of its time experiment was to warn our modern world about the dangers of, in particular, developing into a global surveillance society driven by advancing computer intelligence. But for its warnings to be heeded, it needed to find folk who were sharp enough to understand and do something about those dangers. So it conflated the two times, deliberately corrupted Lucas's messages, and got Ken Webster to write and publish his book in which he'd quote those altered messages. Then 2109 would see if anyone actually spotted the errors, humans sharp enough to understand and respond to its warnings, the humans who had passed its covert IQ test. Now, I fully stand by that interpretation of Ken Webster's account, including that 2109's involvement may have been prophesied by the ancient Mayans. But throughout the entire project, I had a very different interpretation in mind, and discussed it at length with my old friend David York, a respected medieval linguist and historian who contributed greatly to the analysis of the so-called medieval messages. And what sparked that alternative interpretation? Simply by spotting a few slip-ups in the messages and in the retelling of Debbie's strange dreams that could potentially rewrite the entire story, a rewrite that certainly would not be to 2109's liking, as quite possibly I found out. And with that in mind, I'll be giving you a taste of what happened during the making of the original series by inviting you to join me down a convoluted rabbit hole and seeing the darkness, that possible sabotage, seemingly the relentless attempts to put me off doing the investigation. And together we'll explore mishaps and disruptions that collectively provoke that strong feeling of intention, a pattern of deliberate disruption. So what's been going on that makes me wonder if this investigation has been jinxed, deliberately jinxed? Well, basically, there was a stream, a veritable torrent of mishaps throughout the entire Dodleston project that collectively felt like the message, "Stop, or I'll stop you." But I want to say from the outset that all the disruptions could be explained rationally, absolutely. And I'm really trying not to jump to paranormal conclusions. It's too often the lazy way out. But over that long 18 months, I gradually felt a strong sense of unease, that these mishaps were not just a litany of bad luck, but something darker, a shadowy malaise, and something quite deliberate. Even now, as I'll show you first, the disruptions are still happening, even though I thought they'd have ended once the video series had been uploaded. More fool me. For example, a few months ago, I fired up the computer to start on these follow-up videos, Out of curiosity, I checked how many subscribers I'd got and saw this, 666. I laughed, made a screenshot, saved it, and then a blue screen of death. Not just one, not 5, not even 10. I reckon more than 30 in one day, the very day I started this video, all complaining about graphics and USB drivers and page faults and memory management issues. Everything seemed to be having a problem, and all at the same time, which is rather unlikely, particularly as the computer recovered fully the following day, and I've had no such problems since. Now, normally, I'd say this was just the computer sending me messages that it wasn't feeling very well. But over the last 2 years that I've been involved with the Dodleston mysteries, these have not been normal times. Yes, I'm sure the blue screens were messages. But from the computer? Of that, I'm not so sure. Because 2109 had bragged,
I can interfere with all signal transmitting devices, including computers.
Including mine? Had I stumbled on an alternative interpretation that wasn't welcome? An interpretation, a revelation from slip-ups not meant to have been noticed, and thus inviting sabotage? Sabotage? Or just bad luck? So let's dive down the rabbit hole and try to find out. 2020 vision. Seeing clearly. And it was Christmas 2020, when, as a gift, I was given Ken's book. I read it. Fascinating story, really well told. But then I thought, I think there's more to this than meets the eye. It struck me that it was rather like a jigsaw puzzle, but one without the picture on the box to help us. Hoax or not, did it actually contain some deeper significance? Doing a review of it really appealed to me, though it'd have to wait a while. I was busy writing a book on the use of punctuation in Victorian literature, which is as thrilling as it sounds. So thrilling, actually, that having a bit of fun afterwards, my first Louis Sinclair Investigates seemed very attractive. Anyway, book finished, I rang my friend David York. Apart from being a medieval linguist, he's also a spiritualist and very knowledgeable about matters paranormal. I burbled on excitedly about the story and how I wanted to study it in depth. David just said, "Don't do it." I was really taken aback. Why? He said that by immersing oneself in such topics, particularly involving poltergeists and other negative spirits, there was a real danger of attracting unwanted attention. Now, I respect David enormously, and of course took what he had to say very seriously. And then ignored him. And this is what happened, as recorded in my production diary, which includes my thoughts, my reactions at the time, which, as you'll see, gradually move from "gosh, what bad luck" to "what on earth is going on?" But please forgive me if, at times, I'm a little light-hearted about these things. Otherwise, I'm not sure I could have made these follow-up videos. A smile a day keeps the darkness away. For indeed, these memories that I'm about to share with you are a very dark place for me. Anyway, I fired up YouTube, created the channel Louis Sinclair Investigates, and then pottered down to my writing shed at the bottom of the garden. And that night the heavens opened. It seemed that all the clouds in the world had gathered over our house and burst. Next morning I squelched across the lawn, opened the door and saw that the roof had leaked. All my notes had been thoroughly soaked and were now almost illegible, though strangely there was no water anywhere else. Oh, thank you, Fate. Good shot. My diary just says, "Oh dearie dear." Well, that's not exactly what I wrote. Anyway, more rain was forecast, so, like the sensible coward I am, I decided to continue my studies indoors and spent the rest of the day deciphering the soggy notes. Next day I looked at my desk. Where was my copy of The Vertical Plane? It was nowhere to be seen. Does someone not want me to do this? I joked. Many a true word. The diary says, Louis, you're losing your marbles. And in fairness, I am a little absent-minded. Perhaps I'd put it down somewhere without thinking. So I rebought the book and started making good progress. I'd spotted some very revealing clues and curious anomalies about this 2109 character. And then, gradually building to a crescendo, a terrible pain. And a few hours later, I was on the operating table. Post-op, I was supposed to rest for 2 weeks, but I got bored. So after 3 days, I switched on my computer, opened the Dodleston folder, and found nothing. The research, all my notes, pages and pages of them, all gone. I cursed myself. I thought that whilst distracted by pain, I'd accidentally deleted everything. Well, that's what I thought at the time. Anyway, by good fortune, I remembered that just before my little trip to hospital, I'd chucked out a recent hard copy, and luckily it was still there in the outside bin. I put the first page on the scanner for optical character recognition, but whatever that lump of plastic and glass was... Why aren't you working? You're a scanner. It's the only reason you exist. But for some reason, it ignored me. So I had to retype the whole lot, though on the bright side, after I'd finished, the scanner now worked perfectly. I really enjoyed the next 3 months, turning those notes, revelations and ideas into scripts with the help of David York and the friend who'd originally given me the book. That friend is an exceptionally talented video chap. Actually, it was his idea that we do an investigation together of the vertical plane as a joint project. I'd do the research, write the scripts, and he'd do all the visuals, the hard bit. Eventually, the big day arrived. The scripts were finished. So, despite the previous hiccups, as they say, things can only get better. Except they didn't. I remember the day clearly. My video friend rang me up. "I'm sorry, Louis. I can't get involved." He explained that during our collaboration, he and his wife had increasingly been experiencing strange events, strange experiences, strange feelings. Things going missing, cold gusts of air in their house, and worse, feelings, as I said earlier, of a shadowy malaise. To be honest, at the time, I didn't take his concerns seriously. My friend's unavailability was an enormous blow. But foolishly, perhaps, I decided to carry on. And with that, what promised to be a fun 5-month odyssey turned into an 18-month voyage to Hades. After the call, rather downhearted, I went into the studio, picked up the camera, and then thought I heard a cough. I looked round and saw what looked like the shadow of a man swiftly crossing the room. Shocked, I dropped the camera. What does my diary say about it? Apparently, I'm an idiot. Of course it wasn't the shadow of a man, just the mind playing tricks, as it sometimes does. Anyway, next day, I began coughing. The worst cough I've ever experienced. So bad, so violent, that my back and chest were in constant pain. But what scared me most was the risk of causing damage to the wound from my operation, and that I needed oxygen to help me breathe. I'd caught COVID. Anyway, 10 days later, "I'm not going to be beaten," I said, "and to prove it, I'm going to start the studio work." I set up the microphones and a new camera, tested them, perfect. Picture good, audio good, ready to record my on-screen bits. But the recording itself was a nightmare. COVID had left me with a sore throat and a hacking cough. Cough, stop. Start again, cough, stop, start again, and so on and so on. And although the entire series runs for less than 3 hours, I ended up with 27 hours of takes, retakes, re-retakes. It was indeed an absolute nightmare. As you can see, out of curiosity, I've gathered all the coughs. Over 200 of them. But don't worry, I won't show them all, just giving you an idea of what I was up against. Okay, enough. But it was all a waste of time. Because foolishly, and I admit that, I hadn't checked the recordings as I'd gone along. The tests had been good, and quite frankly, I really didn't want to hear the coughing, the choking, the distress, and the bits of ripe Anglo-Saxon. But to my dismay, on reviewing the videos, there was a hiss and a high-pitched squeal all the way through. You may have heard it in the coughing video, particularly at the end, when I look so despondent. I couldn't work out what had caused it. The studio is basically a Faraday cage, so it couldn't have been interference. Totally flummoxed, I rang my friends at Zohar Entertainment Group for technical assistance and spoke, or croaked, with Steve Mira, one of the world's most renowned researchers into the paranormal.
I remember saying to Lewis that he should wear something made of iron because it can protect against bad spirits. He said he'd got a medieval priest ring made of cast iron. Wear it, I said. Don't forget that the whole story begins with poltergeist activity. I suspect that you've attracted them.
Bad spirits, just as David had said. In response to Steve's advice, I just scribbled pish in my diary. I just didn't want to believe that something weird was actually happening. Yes, I've written hundreds of articles about the paranormal, but I'd always felt that paranormal was something that happened to other people. But then something genuinely strange happened. I was in the office, making a few tweaks to the scripts before starting the studio recordings again. My concentration was interrupted by the sound of a coin dropping onto the computer desk. I looked at it. To my astonishment, it was a sovereign. An old British coin made of pure gold. Though no longer legal tender, they were quite common amongst the richer folk in Victorian times. My office ceiling is just the polished undersides of the floorboards above, held up by Victorian blackened beams. Perhaps a Victorian occupant had dropped it whilst in the room above, and it had become trapped between the floorboards and had only now worked loose. Now you may be wondering why I've given it a sabotage number, a warning number. It certainly didn't feel like that at the time. Sovereigns are worth a lot of money, more like a gift than a threat. But after what happened the next day, I came into the office and noticed something strange about my desk. It's always rather messy, but everything was nice and tidy. And that's certainly not how I'd left it the previous evening. It brought back memories of those neatly piled tins of cat food in Meadow Cottage that Ken and his friends had put down to poltergeist activity. My diary entry says, something weird's happening. It was time to take the disruptions, the mishaps and increasingly strange events more seriously. So I took Steve's advice, wore the ring, and indeed, for a while, problems inside the house did stop. But unfortunately, not outside the house. The audio had fixed itself, so I started my second attempt at doing the on-screen recording. Hello and welcome to Louis Sinclair Investigates. Hello and welcome to Louis Sinclair Investigates. Labourers had just arrived next door. Our neighbour was having his driveway dug up and relaid. Now, lifting the old tarmac should only have taken them a day, 2 at the most. But to their bewilderment, the wretched pneumatic drill kept breaking down. So, 10 days of stop and start, and obviously no recording. They left, and 2 uneventful weeks later, the studio recordings were finished. But where was my medieval cast-iron ring? I must have put it down somewhere. As you can see, I've found it since. In the tool room? No matter, I said, referring to the missing ring. I don't need protection anymore, just the visuals left now. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a lot, really. I started off by making the sequence of going upstairs, the one where I'm visiting my old family house, not far from Dodleston, around the time that Lucas had appeared to Debbie through a cloud of green mist. The one where I go upstairs to my old bedroom and momentarily see it as it had been all those years earlier, and also through a green haze. In the video you may recall that I'd said, but as I approached the door, my heart started to pound. Why was I so nervous? Actually, I know exactly why I was so nervous. Through the glass panels of the door, I'd seen that shadow, that silhouette that I saw later when I dropped the camera. The shadow had held up the flat of its palm towards me like a traffic cop, seemingly like a warning not to enter. I didn't mention it in the original video because I just thought it was one of those strange visual things with shadows. But following the camera incident, it seems clear to me now that I should mention it. Anyway, the going upstairs sequence should only have taken me about 3 or 4 days tops. But strangely, each photograph was dark, with a rather nasty brown cast that made the pleasant sandy-coloured carpet look like mud. So I tried again. The same. No choice. It took 3 long, frustrating weeks with Photoshop to make the images acceptable. And then afterwards, when I was working in Premiere Pro on the new studio takes, I realised that something had actually gone wrong with my camera. The aperture, the lightness or darkness control, had changed its settings, which is impossible unless you go to the menu. And if you recall, I was using a new camera and very high quality. Here's how the video should look, taken earlier. And now the later takes, which, as you can see, like the photos, are too dark. Strangely, it's worked fine since. Electronic mischief, perhaps. Anyway, having completed the going upstairs sequence, and to cheer me up, I decided to tackle something that I'd really been looking forward to, the reenactments. A bit of fun, with family, friends and neighbours. Online, I'd bought a medieval costume for Lucas. It arrived and looked great. But where were the boots? Stuck somewhere between here and China. Luckily, I remembered a plastic bag at the back of my wardrobe. As a young man, I'd worked as a chauffeur, and along with the riding boots, still had the uniform, great for fancy dress parties. So all was well. Actually, doing the reenactments was a real boost. Relaxing with Ross and Charlotte, that's Ken and Debbie, with a glass of wine in the sunshine between takes, and goofing around with John, Lucas, in front of our blue screen background. Silly beams of sunshine breaking through the dark clouds. So, the reenactments done, and feeling far more positive, I carried on with the visuals. But within days, the internet went down. And because Adobe software, Photoshop, Premiere Pro and so on, is cloud-based, I was screwed. Engineer after engineer after engineer came out. I'd get a connection for a few days and then... And this went on for nearly 2 months, totally baffling the engineers. My diary entries make for depressing reading. I was so fed up and increasingly feeling uneasy that I was tempted to junk the whole thing. Perhaps I was meant to. Anyway, putting aside such thoughts, I bashed on, and eventually everything was finished, though 1.5 years had gone by. Finished. What a lovely word. I uploaded the videos, and then, 2 weeks later, they disappeared. I'd been hit with a copyright strike, an author's copyright strike on text that was older than Shakespeare's, and the name on the strike was Ken Webster, the author of The Vertical Plane. But that didn't make any sense. Ken Webster is now a highly regarded economist with many books to his name, with lots of quotes in them. Surely he'd realise that by claiming writer's copyright over the medieval messages, he was, in effect, admitting that he'd written them, not Lucas. Basically admitting that he was the author of nothing more than a
cheap hoax,
as 2109 itself had teased. But then I looked at the email address on the strike. This isn't Ken's. Of that I was 100% certain. Actually, it looked a little bit strange. Sorry, for legal reasons I can't show it. Anyway, eventually the videos went back up. The copyright strike was obviously completely spurious. Celebration time. But despite my relief, I didn't feel very well. I'd been working 7 days a week for 18 months with only a handful of days off, a birthday, a Christmas, and an operation. I'd been feeling strangely light-headed for some time and a bit confused, so I went to the doctors. My blood pressure was 210/120. Heart rate 130. I should have been dead, or at the very least, severely incapacitated. Yes, that would certainly have stopped any further investigations. Crikey, I said to David York that evening. According to my diary, that's at least 17 separate calamities. Perhaps you were right. Oh, 17, he replied. That's not good. To the Christianized West, 13 is an unlucky number. But to the ancient Romans, it was the number 17, a premonition or threat of death. You see, if you take 17 in Roman numerals, XVII, and rearrange the numbers, you get VIXI, and vixi in Latin means I have lived. Oh dear. As I said earlier, I'm not the only one who's gone through this. David told me that whenever we discuss the alternative interpretation that we'll be looking at in the next video, he and his wife had been subject to what he called psychic attacks, occasional overwhelming feelings of darkness and objects moving in the house, with glassware smashing to the floor. And there's a group of folk who've been researching the Dodleston mysteries for years, and not always happily. Like this, when recently one of them, who lives in Yorkshire, decided to try and contact 2109 by setting up a BBC micro, installing the Edward EEPROM, like we did in the very first video of the series, and wrote, "Calling 2109." And this is what happened. Results were both astonishing and simultaneously disturbing. Paranormal activity experienced in my home became intense and honestly, genuinely frightened me. Absolutely inexplicable occurrences. My work was shelved and serenity immediately returned. Coincidence? Not in my mind. I would say to anyone attempting this approach to be mindful of the possible outcome. To each their own, but I can't go back to the project. It's impossible to be sure what was coming through, but something very negative was. Extreme caution is the order of the day. And on the 2nd of August 2023, a lady in Essex was on the phone discussing 2109 with a friend when suddenly there was a loud banging from beside the sofa and an apport, the mysterious appearance of a coin in this case, hurtled down on the glass table. I was astounded. It seemed to drop from the ceiling onto the glass table quite heavily, as if thrown. More coins fell and became completely stuck to the glass. I've managed to prize 2 off. One is from Brazil, the other is an old penny. I had neither in my house before. I got the feeling that 2109 had become very angry with my conversation. When I read her email, I was reminded of the sovereign that had dropped on my desk. I took a closer look at it, and as you can see, the date is 1920. Rearrange the numbers. Now you'll understand why I included it in the 17 incidents, seemingly warnings or attempts to put me off looking too closely at the vertical plane, and at 2109 in particular. I honestly have no idea what all this means. Sabotage? Is that possible? But by whom? And why? And that's what we'll be looking at next, when we look very closely at those revealing slip-ups in the messages and in Debbie's curious dreams. So until then, many thanks for watching, and may I respectfully ask you to do those things, please. Thank you. See you after the break. Until then, cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.